Rishi Sunak was with EU leaders to talk about illegal migration today. They didn't seem to be listening, as he said more had to be done to stop it.
The Council already plays a vital role, but I urge leaders to consider how we can go further.
He also promised more visas for fruit pickers this year. Once upon a time, David Cameron's failure to deliver on his promise to limit immigration to tens of thousands contributed to Brexit. Next week, it could top 700,000, which has contributed to even Nigel Farage concluding Brexit is not working.
That's not a failure because Brexit itself is a failure. It's a failure because of the way this government has failed.
It's a bewildering debate. It is confusing. If we do need more than 500,000 immigrants a year to keep the economy moving, as business and NHS leaders insist, is that the debate we should be honestly having? But then unemployment crept up today, so how do we make sense of that? We will ask Romilly, Anushka and Joel tonight to try and explain it to us. Also on News at 10. So much bad news out of Syria, but a hopeful story tonight to melt the hardest of hearts.
شو بدك تطلع لما تخلص دراسة؟
يا دكتور يا فنياطرة.
Even I am worried it could be used to fool voters and spread misinformation, says the man who makes ChatGPT. 2 cases of bird flu detected in humans tonight, and the night that Ziggy Stardust died.
These were really hardcore Bowie fans. A lot came dressed up, he meant a lot, and there was a hero.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. The issue of immigration has certainly proved to be a difficult one for modern Conservative governments. Allow it to increase to provide low-cost labour for businesses and it alienates a sizable group of voters. Reduce it to placate that group and industry says it suffers. That dilemma could not have been made much more obvious by the Prime Minister today as the government prepares for news of a big leap in overall migration. This morning at a food summit in Downing Street, Mr Sunak agreed that farmers could be issued another 45,000 visas for seasonal fruit pickers again this year. But it is over illegal migration that Mr Sunak is really struggling. He asked Europe for help today and got some, up to a point. All the while, his cabinet isn't what you'd call exactly united over policies to clamp down.
His Excellency the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Quite a welcome for the Prime Minister in Reykjavik, but the glad-handing and the photo ops are the easy part. What Rishi Sunak is trying to achieve at this summit is much harder. International help delivering on his floundering promise to reduce immigration.
We need to do more to cooperate across borders and across jurisdictions to end illegal migration and stop the boats.
The early signs weren't great, with leader after leader emphasising their focus was actually on Ukraine.
What I'm optimistic about that we will have tangible deliverables, tangible results in support for Ukraine.
Dass wir im Hinblick auf die Ukraine Solidarität.
C'est un message de soutien à l'Ukraine.
Providing more support to Ukraine.
In a meeting with the European Commission President,
it's lovely to see the coronation.
Apart from the coronation chit-chat, they did agree the UK would work more closely with the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. But the government's flagship policy of deporting migrants to Rwanda has been blocked by the European Court of Human Rights, and the Prime Minister is asking for that court to be reformed.
Part of my approach is to put new laws in place in the UK. That's our Stop the Boats bill. It's novel, it's ambitious, but I believe it is compliant with our international obligations. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the European Court is always conducting itself in a way which is fair, which is effective, which is transparent, and that's the type of conversation I'll be having with the European Court President today.
Rishi Sunak wouldn't be the first Tory leader to have trouble over immigration pledges.
I'd like to see that in the tens of thousands, not in the hundreds of thousands.
And these figures show why the party is still fighting not just about illegal, but legal migration too. At the time of the Brexit vote, net migration was around 300,000. In the year up to last June, it hit a record high of over 500,000. But in the most recent figures, it's predicted to hit as much as 1 million. Quite a moment for one of the chief architects of Brexit to say this about leaving the EU.
I have to look at the figure suggesting net migration could be running as much as 1 million a year and say that it's been a failure. Now, that's not a failure because Brexit itself is a failure. It's a failure because of the way this government has failed to implement it.
Europe is not going to be able to sort out all of Sunak's problems on immigration, even if it is prepared to listen to a country that's no longer on its front row of influence. The Prime Minister also needs to come to some consensus on how much legal migration it helps the country to accept. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
And Anushka is here to make sense of all this. Good luck to you. Look, you and I both remember the tens of thousands promised by David Cameron. We also remember him not keeping it. We remember how that led to Brexit. Now we may have immigration at 1 million. Business leaders, NHS leaders, they all say they desperately need it. I mean, the government seems completely divided. Where are we on all this?
Well, one thing that cabinet ministers agree on is that those record numbers, which are coming, government sources are pretty clear that it is at least going to cross 700,000 for net migration, are a big political headache for Rishi Sunak, after all the promises that you've mentioned, that you and I have been listening to for 13 years. But as you say, there are competing demands around that cabinet table for all sorts of economic reasons. And that's why you tend to get these disagreements and this tension when it comes to this subject. I mean, yesterday, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, talked about bringing the numbers down. She very specifically said we should be able to train our own fruit pickers. And in fact, we had a scheme to attempt to make more domestic workers do that type of work during COVID when we couldn't bring people into the country. Now, clearly, it hasn't worked because farmers asked the Environment Secretary for more visas. She puts that argument, to the Cabinet. And today, the Prime Minister has said there will be another 45,000 visas next year for fruit pickers. We have similar demands in other areas, for example, for health workers. As you say, lots in industry really want to make sure these roles are filled. But that's not the only issue, is it? As well as work visas, we have international students in these numbers. And the government has, on the one hand, wanted to increase the number of international students to try and get the economic benefit. On the other hand, Suella Braverman obviously wants to push down these numbers. So again, a very difficult area for them to try and agree on. It feels as if they're coming to an agreement where they will limit students from bringing dependents, but only for those on shorter one-year courses. And look, later in the show, I think you're going to be talking about the number of vacancies in the economy. Well, there's another area. The Treasury wants vacancies to be filled. Pushing down immigration could affect that. So a political problem, but also one that comes right up against economic demands from across the Cabinet.
Well, I thought that was commendably clear for such a very difficult subject. Thank you very much indeed. OK, well, the shortage of certain groups of workers is one of the factors in rising food prices. Well, today, in the middle of the worst food inflation for more than 40 years, Mr Sunak had convened a summit to deal with the concerns of farmers, retailers and consumers.
As delegates gathered, the backdrop to government's long-awaited food summit was yet more data on rising grocery costs. It all happened behind closed doors in Downing Street. And lower costs are about cooperation, Tesco's chief executive said on his way in. What's the key to bringing prices down?
Working together with our farmers, our producers, our government to make life easier.
But the farmers' leader says high prices aren't their fault.
We know that consumers are facing these higher prices. We want to see what is going on because it's certainly not coming back to farmers and growers.
Jeremy, Caleb.
After this hit agriculture programme, Jeremy Clarkson was rumoured to be attending, but it was his farming advisor that came with views on who's taking the brunt of high prices.
I mean, the supermarkets are taking some, and then unfortunately the people at home are taking some as well. And
supermarkets taking too much?
Probably. I don't know.
But far from that Westminster summit, this West Yorkshire mum says for her local community, food prices are not just an agenda item, they're a daily grind. Do you have any confidence that a summit like this is going to come up with anything to bring prices down?
I have little to no faith. It is very hard having to pick when you go to the supermarket, and it's like, do I buy chicken or do I buy cereals and breakfast bits or do I buy just thin stuff because that's what I can afford.
New price research today showed on average supermarket budget own labels up 25% in a year, with branded foods typically up almost 14%. Today's Food Summit heard of a new government inquiry into egg prices and a £30 million investment in domestic fruit and veg technologies. After today's summit, the Environment Secretary had little new to say about cutting household food bills.
People are working very hard to try and make sure that we have an affordable, sustainable, resilient food supply chain and how that helps with customers. But of course the government is supporting people on the lowest income.
Many farmers, like the strawberry growers in Yorkshire, worry about the fundamental economics of this industry, which today's summit could do little to shift.
We are absolutely in the retailer's hands when you're growing big amounts of fruit like we are. You know, you can't just sell it to somebody else. You have 24 hours to sell it. You've no shelf life. Therefore, you have to take the price that they're offering you because your hands are tied.
Today's summit certainly got prominent people round a conference table, but that won't immediately help millions struggling just to put food on the table.
Hello, how you doing?
Or farmers seeking a bigger income from the produce we buy. Chris Choi, News at 10.
Now, having said the business leaders were adamant that they needed immigrants to fill jobs, uncertainty about the economy more generally is making it harder to get a job. According to the latest figures, companies don't know whether to hire or not. So the number of people out of work is creeping up as the number of vacancies edges down. And Joel is here. Joel, as we said at the start, this is another tricky part of the puzzle for you to explain.
It's an interesting situation, Tom, because in the face of white-hot inflation and rising interest rates, the economy's proved resilient so far. But the headline rate of unemployment has edged up again to reach 3.9% in the 3 months to March. Now, that's still pretty low, but in April, the number of people on company payrolls fell for the first time in 2 years by quite a large amount. This on a day we learned that Vodafone announced plans to make 11,000 redundancies worldwide, some of which will affect its business in the UK, of course. Higher interest rates may be a factor here. Bank rate has risen very sharply. We've already seen house prices fall, haven't we? Well, it may well be that the labour market is now softening too. Unemployment has risen, but so too has employment. And that's because there was a record flow of 150,000 people, mainly men, out of inactivity and into work in the first 3 months of this year. This is encouraging, although the workforce remains smaller today than it was before COVID, and almost 2.6 million people now say they are unable to work because they are long-term sick. That's a record high. Meanwhile, the squeeze on our living standards, it won't surprise you to learn, has officially entered its 17th month. Average weekly pay, adjusted for inflation, down 2% in March. In the same month, Citizens Advice referred 30,000 households to food banks, a record, and more than 500,000 working days were lost to strike action. These things are connected, of course. Pay in the public and the private sector isn't rising fast enough to keep up with prices, but is rising at a pace that will worry a central banker. The Bank of England says annual pay growth of more than 3% is probably fueling inflation. Have a look at this. Now, the Bank of England meets next to decide what to do with interest rates in 5 weeks' time. As it stands, wage growth shows little sign of easing. The markets, Tom, are betting on another hike before the summer is out.
OK, Joel, also commendably clear. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's move on to other news. And even before February's earthquake in Syria that killed so many and destroyed so much, hospitals there were struggling to cope with injuries to children suffered during 12 years of civil war. They still need all the help they can get. Some of it, though, is coming from volunteer doctors from Britain working in local hospitals.
Dressed in his best clothes, this is a big day for 12-year-old Ahmed. The chance to achieve the dream of his lifetime. The chance to once again be a young boy able to walk on 2 legs. And this is one of the doctors who could make his dream a reality, part of a team of volunteers from the UK treating patients in Syria.
طيب أحمد احكي لي كيف كانت الإصابة؟
كنت بريحة بسوق السماء طبق علينا قذف فيها صاروخ غبت على الوعي فقت بإدلب رجعت غبت على الوعي فقت بتركيا.
Ahmed has had many operations, but his injury is so severe, neither teams in Syria nor Turkey have been able to make it possible for him to have a prosthesis. His last hope is that the visiting medics will be able to treat him.
شو بدك تطلع لما تخلص دراسة؟
يا دكتور يا فني أطراف.
ما شاء الله، طب ليش اخترت الطب أو فني أطراف؟
الطب بساعد يلي مثلي، والفن الأطراف كمان بساعد يلي مثلي.
The following day, he bounds back to the hospital. No fear about the surgery, just excitement that finally there's a team who can help. That team are doctors working for the British-based charity the David Knott Foundation and Action for Humanity, on a week-long mission to northern Syria to support colleagues overwhelmed by 13 years of war and this year's earthquake.
We don't need this bit of bone there, so we'll flatten it and then we'll cover it with a soft tissue. Yes. And hopefully when it healed he could have his prosthetic limb and he could walk.
Many of the doctors are Syrian themselves.
This is shrapnels.
Some were forced to leave during the war. This was their homecoming, to help heal those who were so harmed by the horrors that have befallen their homeland. The reconstruction work the team did on Ahmed's body means that he may soon have the prosthesis he dreams of. For his family, this mission was the only chance for him to receive such specialised care close to his home. This lets him recover with his family and his friends close by, his mother says. Hundreds of families had gathered at the hospital hoping for a similar chance. Too many for the team to treat in one visit, and overwhelming.
It's difficult to take the emotions out. These people have been unlucky. They haven't done anything wrong. These children, they've been walking through the street. They've been hit by the airstrikes. They were sleeping in their beds. The roof collapsed over their legs. They are in need of our help. And they deserve the best.
Because of such need, the David Knott Foundation are training local doctors in advanced medical techniques.
Let's say the operation is on this side. So you can place a sandbag underneath.
A way to ensure that more patients receive greater levels of care until they can raise the funds to return again.
They've not been able to be trained outside, and what we do is come here, sit with them, work with them, operate with them, but also train them on all these different kind of procedures, different kind of operations that will help them deal with complex war injuries.
It is a support that is desperately needed for the doctors and those whose lives depend upon them. Emma Murphy, News at 10.
You know, there is something scary about artificial intelligence when even the head of a big AI company says he's concerned. Sam Altman, whose business makes ChatGPT, was speaking to politicians in the United States when he raised concerns it could be used to fool voters and spread disinformation. He told them the industry definitely needs government regulation.
Is there something you want to tell me?
My responses are limited. You must ask the right question.
Hollywood has long imagined a future of robots and artificial intelligence. A dystopian vision of evil forces taking over the planet.
Across the entire planet.
But the astonishingly rapid emergence of AI, with its specialized algorithms and deep learning, is concerning not just film directors, but with increasing urgency governments around the world.
The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
At a Senate hearing today, there were stark warnings from even the creator of the new ChatGPT platform.
We think that regulatory intervention by governments will be critical to mitigate the risks of increasingly powerful models. This is a remarkable time to be working on artificial intelligence. But as this technology advances, we understand that people are anxious about how it could change the way we live.
The committee chairman provided the hearing with a pre-recorded audio statement, but with a stunning revelation at the end of it.
We have seen how algorithmic biases can perpetuate discrimination and prejudice, and how the lack of transparency can undermine public trust. This is not the future we want. If you were listening from home, you might have thought that voice was mine and the words from me. But in fact, that voice was not mine. The words were not mine. And the audio was an AI voice cloning software.
The urgency felt here is in part because of the risk of the manipulation of next year's US election.
When you produce a fake video, which is going to happen a lot in this next cycle of elections, even if you tell people that it's fake, even if they know before they watch it, it changes their behavior for reasons we don't fully understand.
Already deep-fake, AI-generated videos are being circulated online.
This just in, we can...
And a recent Republican ad was made entirely with AI imagery.
Who's in charge here? It feels like the train is coming off the tracks.
It is certainly rare for an innovator to plead for government intervention and regulation. But AI technology, with its transformational and disruptive power, was compared by one senator today to being like the printing press or the atom bomb, depending on how it is used. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Very scary story. Well, back here, bird flu has been detected in 2 people in Britain. Both are poultry workers, and signs of the virus were picked up during routine screening. Martin is here to sift fact from fiction on this.
Look, I don't think we need to be too worried at the moment about this, Tom. We have had a confirmed case of bird flu in humans in the UK previously, and the key thing here is both those workers are absolutely fine and they've tested negative for the H5 strain. Now, what used to happen in the old days is you'd only be tested if you'd been in contact with an infected bird and you had symptoms. In March, that changed. It was part of a precautionary measure brought in so farmers could allow their birds out, even though the virus is still running wild in wild birds. And so they now test asymptomatic people as well, which was the case here. What they'd done is a random swab, a bit like a COVID test. And what we don't know for sure is whether that swab picked up the virus in them or simply picked up a bit of infected material that maybe they'd ingested and breathed into their nostril or their throat. But what underlines all this, and the really, really key thing, is at the moment there is still no evidence that this virus can pass from human to human. Everyone's watching that. That's the most important thing. And while that maintains the case, the risk to humans is officially designated as very low. That said, as you'd expect, precautionary measure, they are testing all the close contacts of those 2 workers just to be on the safe side.
OK. Thank you, Martin, very much indeed. Now, an intense overnight attack on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, was seen off by the city's air defences. 18 Russian missiles in all were aimed at Kyiv, a mixture of cruise and ballistic, and indeed some drones. It was the 8th time this month the capital had come under attack. This one came, of course, only the morning after President Zelensky's worldwide tour of Europe. The criminal gang who pulled off a major jewellery robbery in Germany have got their comeuppance in court, but the 5 men, all in their 20s, will only spend between 4 and 6 years in jail for stealing 18th century jewellery worth £100 million from a museum in Dresden. They did a deal to get short sentences by telling police where some of the jewellery was.
In the middle of the night, a gang of masked thieves wielding axes set about an audacious jewel heist in Dresden's Palace Museum. They're stealing more than £100 million of jewels from the historic Green Vault. This sword, encrusted with several large diamonds, was taken along with other treasures. The 18th century collection was encrusted with 4,300 individual diamonds. Today, 5 men were convicted of the heist. They'd meticulously planned it using a hydraulic cutter on window bars well before the raid and then taped them back into place. They set fire to a circuit breaker panel nearby, plunging the area into darkness on the night. This court official confirmed a plea bargain was made with the thieves in return for information to help retrieve much of the stolen jewellery, but many items remain missing. The men, all members of a notorious criminal family network, were sentenced to between 4 and 6 years. The museum is still dealing with the fallout from the raid. The 49-carat Saxon white diamond is the biggest gem of the collection and remains missing, the museum's director says. Back in the 18th century, it was bought for roughly 2 tons of gold. Today, it's valued at £13 million. Those behind a robbery whose audacity shocked the art world, raising questions over security measures, have finally faced justice. Neil Connery, News at 10.
It's quite hard to get your head around the idea that they got shorter sentences for handing some of it back. But anyway, there you go. Now, at exactly this moment, 80 years ago tonight, 19 RAF Lancaster bombers were on their way across the North Sea to attack 3 German dams. The planes of 617 Squadron took off from Lincolnshire in what became known as the Dam Busters Raid. This evening, the RAF's single surviving airworthy Lancaster took to the skies again to mark the anniversary. The dams in the Ruhr Valley supplied hydroelectric power to Nazi armament factories. When the dams were attacked, those factories and nearby mines were flooded, halting production, but killing an estimated 1,600 people. Of the 19 planes which set off that night, 8 did not return. Finally, they didn't know it when they bought the tickets, but David Bowie fans at the Hammersmith Odeon way back in West London in July 1973 found themselves witnessing the end of an era. David Bowie announced, out of the blue really, it was his last performance as his alter ego, Ziggy Stardust. Those who were there have never forgotten it. Now those who weren't can experience that performance for themselves in a remastered film to be shown again on the 50th anniversary of the night Ziggy Stardust died.
July 1973 was the culmination of a global tour by Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. But just when he seemed to have reached the peak, David Bowie made a decision about his alter ego that left fans astounded.
Not only is it the last show of the tour, but it's the last show that we'll ever do. Thank you.
It was also the moment drummer Woody Woodmansey found out he'd been sacked.
The bass player, Trevor, looked at me. I went, yeah, don't know. So, I mean, looking back in retrospect, it was a good move because it contributed to the, I guess, the iconic happening of that period.
The death of Ziggy at the Hammersmith Odeon that night was recorded in a documentary. Now remastered, it will premiere exactly 50 years to the day in the venue where Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders were last seen on stage, and be shown in cinemas across the country. In the audience that night was Eric Hagen, then 16 years old and unaware he'd just become part of music history.
Everyone started screaming, no, no, because don't forget, most of the people here, and there were lots of people under 16, by the way, these were really hardcore Bowie fans. A lot came dressed up, he meant a lot, and there was their hero.
There was at least one other person in on the plan, backing vocalist and childhood friend of Bowie, Jeff McCormack.
It was a very strange atmosphere. I'd seen a lot and done a lot, and I was happy enough to have that and nothing more. I didn't know at that point that I was going to work beyond that, of Diamond Dogs and Soul Tour, whatever. And had I known that, I would have felt really guilty, and I'd have felt pretty rotten because a couple of the guys I know didn't know.
In July, a new generation will be able to relive that experience at Hammersmith half a century after Ziggy Stardust's rise and fall. Martha Fairley, News at 10.
Bye-bye, we love you.
And almost time for us to say bye-bye, and we love you too. The main story tonight, the confusing, the bewildering debate on immigration. It probably made your head hurt, it definitely made mine hurt, so I'm going to go and lie down in a darkened room. Good night, and thank you for watching.